The United States covers about 3.8 million square miles, and most people only ever see a thin slice of it. The interstates, the big cities, the national parks on the postcards. But scattered in between are places that hold something much darker, and most Americans have never heard of them. A glamorous desert resort where the beaches are now made of bones. A coal town that has been burning from underneath for more than 60 years. A place once rated the most toxic town in America, where the children's blood ran with lead. And our number one, an island half a mile off the Bronx, where more than 1 million people lie in unmarked mass graves dug by prison inmates with no headstones at all. Make sure you stick with us to the end, because that story is number one on this list. Welcome to the channel where we dig up the places history tried to bury. If you have not subscribed yet, hit that button now, because we post stories like this every single week. Today we are counting down 10 US places that hide terrifying secrets that almost no one talks about. Let's go. Number 10. Bombay Beach, California. The resort that drowned in its own sea. In the 1950s, this was the place to be seen. Frank Sinatra played here. The Beach Boys played here. The North Shore Beach and Yacht Club opened in 1962 on the edge of California's largest lake, and the desert filled with vacationers. Today, the beaches are made of bones. Here is how the lake got there. It was an accident. In 1905, engineers diverting Colorado River water for Imperial Valley Farms lost control of the flow, and the river poured into a basin below sea level for roughly 2 years. The first flood alone was moving 14,000 cubic feet of water per second. Developers later sold the accidental lake as a paradise. The problem was that the Salton Sea had no outlet. The water could only evaporate, and as it did, the salt in the farm runoff concentrated year after year until the salinity climbed past that of the Pacific Ocean. The fish died in the millions. The birds died in the thousands. Storms in the late 1970s wrecked the shoreline and the people left. What they left behind is a slow-motion disaster. The exposed lakebed throws up dust laced with arsenic and selenium, dust that has reached Los Angeles 120 miles away. The water smells of rotten eggs. Imperial County declared a state of emergency over the air, and one report put the cost of doing nothing at up to $70 billion over 30 years. A few hundred people still live in Bombay Beach. The Ski Inn still pours drinks. And since around 2016, artists have held a festival here whose very first theme was the art of decay. People now drive across the desert specifically to photograph the ruins. A town that was sold as paradise now survives by charging admission to its own collapse. Number 9. Helltown, Ohio. The town the government erased. The stories will tell you almost anything. A satanic church with an upside-down cross. A phantom school bus full of children. A chemical spill that turned the locals into mutants. Helltown is supposedly one of the most haunted places in the Midwest. Almost none of it is true. The real town was called Boston Township, settled in 1806 and officially organized in 1811. An ordinary mill and canal community. What happened to it was not supernatural, it was bureaucratic. In 1974, Congress passed a law allowing the federal government to acquire land for the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area. Boston Township was inside the lines. Residents were forced out by eminent domain, their homes boarded up, and the bulldozers moved in. Then the money ran out. Demolition stopped halfway, and the streets sat frozen mid-evacuation for years. That is where the legends came from. A town full of sealed, empty houses, no clear explanation, and a name like Helltown. The Travel Channel even aired a special about it, which turned out to be a mockumentary. Snopes found that its expert folklore professor was an actor, and that the Wendigo killing and the cult shootout it described never happened. The land became Cuyahoga Valley National Park in 2000, and the last structures came down around 2016. The scariest thing about Helltown was never the ghosts. It was how easily a whole community could be emptied for a park that barely got built. Number 8. Dudleytown, Connecticut, the Village of the Damned. Off a road called Dark Entry, deep in the hills of Cornwall, There is a forest where the sunlight barely reaches the ground. Scattered through it are stone cellar holes and the low remains of foundations. This is all that is left of Dudleytown, and for 50 years people have called it cursed. The legend is specific. It says the Dudley family carried a curse from England, where an ancestor was beheaded for treason, and that the curse followed them to Connecticut and drove the villagers to madness, suicide, and death. Here is the thing. Historians have checked, and there is no genealogical link between the Cornwall Dudleys and that executed nobleman. The land was originally Mohawk territory, and the real reason the settlement failed is almost boringly practical. The soil was poor, the valley was damp and starved of sunlight, water was hard to reach, and by the early 1900s, families simply left for better land out west. Cornwall's population had roughly halved, down to 834. So where did the curse come from? Most of it traces to one source, a 1926 local history by Edward Starr that gave Dudleytown about 2 pages. Then, in the 1970s, demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, the couple behind the Amityville case, filmed a Halloween special there and pronounced it demonically possessed. Books, television, and eventually TikTok did the rest. The Cornwall Historical Society has no record of any haunting before Starr wrote it down, which means the ancient curse of Dudleytown is younger than the automobile. The ghost tourists got so destructive that the private landowners closed it for good. People came looking for a centuries-old evil. What they were really standing in was a story barely 100 years old. Number 7. Old Cahaba, Alabama. The ghost capital that fed America's forgotten disaster. Alabama's very first state capital is now a ghost town. Old Cahaba sits where the Cahaba and Alabama rivers meet, and today it is grassy streets, moss-draped oaks, and crumbling brick. But the secret buried here connects to the worst maritime disaster in American history. Cahaba was a gift of raw wilderness from President Monroe, made the state capital in 1819. Its low, swampy, flood-prone site gave rivals the argument they needed, and the capital moved to Tuscaloosa in 1826. The town clawed its way back as a cotton port through the 1840s and 50s. Then the Civil War arrived. The Confederacy seized the town's railroad and converted a cotton warehouse into a prisoner of war camp, officially Cahaba Federal Prison, unofficially Castle Morgan. It covered less than 1/3 of an acre. At one point, it held more than 3,000 Union prisoners. Here is the part almost no one knows. When the war ended in 1865, those prisoners were paroled and sent to Vicksburg, where many boarded a steamboat called the Sultana to go home. On April 27, 1865, north of Memphis, 3 of the Sultana's boilers exploded. Of about 2,100 former prisoners aboard, between 1,700 and 1,800 died. Roughly 800 of them were Cahaba men. That is more dead than the Titanic. But it happened just weeks after Lincoln was assassinated, and the country was looking elsewhere. The disaster slipped out of memory almost immediately. Cahaba had one more chapter. During Reconstruction, freed African Americans gathered in the abandoned courthouse to organize, turning the dead capital into what locals called the Mecca of the Radical Republican Party. One area leader, Jeremiah Harrelson, went from being born into slavery to the United States Congress. Then the town emptied. By 1900, its buildings had burned, fallen, or been carted off to Selma for their bricks. It is an archaeological park now. You can walk the streets where a state was governed and stand on the prison foundation that sent 800 men to a river they never expected to die in. Number 6. Centralia, Pennsylvania. The town on fire since 1962. Underneath this town, a fire has been burning since 1962. It is still burning right now. Centralia was a coal town, more than 2,500 people at its peak in 1890. It sat on top of one of the most energy-dense coal types on Earth, in ground honeycombed by abandoned mine tunnels. And in May 1962, the borough decided to clean up its garbage dump the way it always had, by setting it on fire. This time the fire found a gap. Burning trash dropped through an unsealed opening into a coal seam below, and the seam caught. The firefighters believed they had put it out. They had not. The fire spread into the maze of old tunnels, where there was effectively unlimited fuel and no way to reach it. For 2 decades, people argued about how serious it was. Then the ground started answering them. A gas station owner measured the temperature in his underground tanks at around 172 degrees. And in 1981, a 12-year-old boy was nearly swallowed alive when a steaming sinkhole opened beneath his feet. That was the end. Carbon monoxide, smoke, and collapsing earth made the town unlivable. In the 1980s, more than 1,000 residents took a federal buyout, and roughly 500 buildings were demolished. In 1992, the state claimed all of it by eminent domain. The Postal Service revoked Centralia's zip code in 2002. The fire is still monitored through boreholes drilled into the ground. At its current rate, it has enough fuel to keep burning for more than 250 years. A town once tried to dispose of its trash with a controlled fire. That fire will outlive everyone who was ever angry about the mess. We are halfway down the list. If these stories are pulling you in, drop a thumbs up and tell me in the comments which of these places unsettles you the most so far. I read every one because from here, it gets heavier. The next places were not abandoned by accident. They were poisoned, evacuated, and in one case, deliberately kept secret. Number 5. Love Canal, New York. The neighborhood built on 22,000 tons of poison. A chemical company once sold a toxic waste dump to a school board for $1. What happened next became one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. The Love Canal was an abandoned 19th century canal dig in Niagara Falls. Through the 1940s and 50s, the Hooker Chemicals and Plastics Corporation used it as a graveyard for its waste. Nearly 22,000 tons of it, including PCBs, dioxin, and pesticides. When it was full, Hooker capped the site in clay and handed it to the Niagara Falls School Board for that single $1, with a clause in the deed meant to wash its hands of whatever was buried. A neighborhood grew on top. 2 schools, a kindergarten, and hundreds of family homes, many belonging to the chemical workers themselves. For years, residents noticed strange things. Colored, oily puddles in their yards, black sludge seeping into their basements. Then the chemicals arrived in force. In 1978, the state confirmed toxic waste was leaching into homes. Investigators found abnormally high rates of chromosomal damage, miscarriages, and illness. The women of the neighborhood, who ran their own door-to-door health surveys and were dismissed at first as hysterical housewives, turned out to be right. President Carter declared emergencies in 1978 and again in 1980. Hundreds of families were relocated, and the disaster led directly to the 1980 Superfund law. Here is the detail that should stop people cold. Love Canal was not even Hooker's biggest dump. Down the road at the Hyde Park landfill, the company buried roughly 4 times as much waste, and it drew a fraction of the attention. The core site is capped and fenced today. The land just north was renamed Black Creek Village and quietly resettled. A new name on a neighborhood that the old name nearly killed. Number 4. Times Beach, Missouri. The town erased by a dust cure. In the early 1970s, a small Missouri town had a simple problem. Its dirt roads were dusty. The solution it chose erased the town from the map. Times Beach began in 1925 as a newspaper gimmick. A 6-month subscription to the St. Louis Times plus $67.50 bought you a riverside lot. It grew into a modest community of more than 2,000 people along the Merrimack River. It never had the money to pave its roads, so the town hired a waste hauler named Russell Bliss to spray the roads with oil and hold the dust down. What the town did not know was that Bliss had also been paid to get rid of chemical waste. Waste contaminated with dioxin, a byproduct of producing Agent Orange and related chemicals. He mixed it into the oil and sprayed it across Times Beach. The first sign was the animals: birds, cats and dogs, and horses. At one stable, 62 of them died between 1971 and 1973. For a decade, the people of Times Beach breathed and walked through dioxin without knowing it was there. Then 2 things happened at once. In 1982, federal tests came back showing dioxin at around 100 parts per billion, in a place where the EPA considered 1 part per billion toxic. and that December, the Merrimack River flooded worse than it ever had, washing the contamination across every yard and every home in town. That was the end of Times Beach. In early 1983, the government announced a buyout worth more than $30 million. The governor disincorporated the town in 1985. By 1992, it was demolished, the soil incinerated and buried. It was the largest civilian dioxin exposure in American history. And here is the strange afterlife. The cleaned, decontaminated ground reopened in 1999 as Route 66 State Park. Families picnic there now. Most of them have no idea they are standing on the grave of a town that was poisoned to keep its dust down. Number 3. Hanford, Washington, the secret city that made the bomb. In 1943, the United States government quietly seized a huge stretch of desert along the Columbia River, evicted the farming towns of Hanford and White Bluffs, and built a secret city almost no one was allowed to know about. Its purpose was plutonium. Hanford produced the plutonium for the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki, and it kept producing through the entire Cold War until it was finally shut down in 1989. Over those decades, it made the material for more than 60,000 nuclear weapons. It also made an almost unimaginable amount of waste, on the order of 212 million liters of it. To this day, 177 aging underground tanks hold about 56 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste. And much of it did not stay contained. More than 400 billion gallons of contaminated waste seeped into the ground around Hanford, a fact that only became public years later because of a culture of secrecy born in wartime. Contaminated cooling water was discharged straight into the Columbia River. The families living downwind were not told. Here is what the scale really means. The plan for the worst of the waste is to lock it inside glass, to turn it solid so it cannot leak. By one project scientist's estimate, that glass has to hold for upwards of 1 million years before the radioactive material inside decays to something safe. Today, Hanford is an active cleanup site that costs billions of dollars a year, and it is expected to run for generations. The original B reactor is now part of a national park, open for tours. In places, the orchards those evicted farmers planted still stand, gone wild, the last trace of the towns that were cleared so the secret could be kept. A secret city built to end one war left behind a problem that will outlast recorded human history. Number 2. Peacher, Oklahoma. America's most toxic town and the man who wouldn't leave. For a while, this was officially rated the most contaminated place in the United States. Today, Peacher is barely there at all. It started with a discovery. In 1913, miners struck lead and zinc in the far northeast corner of Oklahoma, and a town exploded out of the ground almost overnight. It was named for O.S. Peacher of the Peacher Lead Company, incorporated in 1918, and by 1926, it held more than 14,000 people. This was no backwater. Over half of the lead and zinc used by America in World War I came from the Peacher field. Between 1917 and 1947, it produced more than $20 billion in ore. The bullets of 2 world wars were born here. But the mining did 2 things. It hollowed out the ground beneath the town into roughly 14,000 abandoned shafts, and it heaped the surface with giant gray mountains of toxic mining waste called chat. Children climbed those piles. They swam in the ponds beside them. The creeks ran orange and red with lead, zinc, cadmium, and arsenic. Former residents remember coming out of the water with what they thought was sunburn. It was chemical burns. In 1983, the area became part of the Tar Creek Superfund site. A 1994 study found that around 34% of Peacher's children had lead poisoning. Then came the danger from below, the threat that the honeycombed ground could simply collapse. The government began buying the town out. And in May 2008, an EF4 tornado tore through, killing 6 people and destroying more than 100 homes. For most of those left, that was the end. But not for everyone. The town's pharmacist, Gary Linderman, refused to leave. He kept his drugstore open in a town that was dying around him, the last man standing until he died in 2015. Peacher is essentially erased now. The buildings are gone, the chat piles remain, so do the poisoned creeks. A town that helped arm the country for 2 world wars was, in the end, defeated by what it dug out of its own ground. Number 1. Hart Island, New York. You arrive by ferry because there is no other way. No bridge, no road, just a short crossing of Long Island Sound from the edge of the Bronx. The island is low and flat and windswept. Gulls, water, and then a profound, total silence. As you walk, you start to notice the markers. Not headstones, plain white posts, set into the ground at intervals, each one numbered. There are no names anywhere. Behind them, the crumbling shells of old institutional buildings stand against the sky, and somewhere near the shore there is a single tall monument. Nothing about the place tells you what it is. You have to be told. This is Hart Island. It is New York City's Potter's Field, and it is the largest one in the United States. For more than 150 years, this island has been the final destination for the city's most invisible people. The unclaimed, the unidentified, and those too poor to afford a burial. New York bought the island in 1868. The first person buried here, in 1869, was a 24-year-old woman named Louisa Van Slyke, who had been born at sea and died alone. Since then, the count has grown to more than 1 million. They are not buried in individual graves. They are laid in long mass trenches, the coffins stacked roughly 3 deep, and for many years the digging was done by inmates brought over from Rikers Island. Each trench gets one of those numbered white posts. That is the only record on the ground. The island has worn many faces. A Civil War prison camp for Confederate soldiers, a workhouse, a tuberculosis hospital, a psychiatric facility, a boys' reformatory, a Cold War missile base, and through all of it, the burials never stopped. Hart Island is described as perhaps the single largest burial ground in the country for people who died of AIDS. And in the early 1980s, when fear of the disease was at its height, those victims were buried deeper and apart from the rest. The first child to die of AIDS in New York City lies here under a marker that reads only SC-B1, 1985. Then came COVID-19. In 2020 alone, more than 2,000 people were buried on Hart Island, the most since the influenza pandemic of 1918. Drone footage showed workers in hazmat suits lowering plain pine boxes into the trenches, exactly as it had been done by hand in photographs from the 1890s. Here is what stays with you. The burials are so anonymous that when a family finally tracks down a lost relative, workers have to dig through stacks of identical numbered caskets to find the right one. For most of its history, the island was sealed off so completely that the city living half a mile away barely knew it existed. 1 million New Yorkers, half a mile from the Bronx. And almost no one ever says their names because almost no one ever knew them. The United States is full of places like these. Towns and islands the maps still show, but whose stories got left behind. For me, the one that stays is Hart Island. 1 million people, half a mile from a city of millions, and almost no one knows they are there. Which of these surprised you the most, and what did we miss? If you like the places history tried to bury, subscribe. We find another one every week.